topic, of course, is quite broad. Creating sustainable growth through smart energy and transportation infrastructure. Sustainable growth, when coupled with those two terms, smart energy and transport infrastructure, needs to take into account a number of factors which cannot be encapsulated by any one discipline, any one industry, any one sort of school of thought. So that's why we're quite lucky to have with us a wide-ranging panel, ranging from industry, policy, and what would I say, sort of a grassroots input into the story. Where do the finance comes from, how those choices are made. So before starting and handing over to our esteemed colleagues here, I'd just like to add that underlying this story is a story of cities and urbanization, which remains unsaid, but it's not limited to that. The fact that how any of those things over here evolve and shape the future of migration as well as those of cities, and how different countries with different geographies and economics try to connect and not only modify but also optimize their well-being and growth. So those are the underlying topics which are interesting for all of us, and I think it'll be wonderful to start with Rajan, head of the policy for North India in the Federal Affairs for Uber.
Thank you, Dr. Saxena. So the topic is something which is very, very relevant to Uber as a key ride-sharing player in the Indian market. When we're talking about, and this has been a buzzword for the past 3 to 4 years, that what are we doing on the smart cities front? I think one thing to understand about smart cities is that a smart city will be built on the backbone of smart mobility. And currently, the way that our cities are being designed, there is an insanity to it because we are actually incentivizing private car ownership by creating more parking spots, by increasing road lengths, and even when we look at the other factors that actually suggest that such policy decisions should not be taken, it is something that we have ignored in our effort to design cities in a proper manner. I just want to start with sharing some data points with you on the gravity of the problem that Indian cities are facing right now, and why we cannot afford to follow a model that the United States followed in the 90s or the 80s in terms of car ownership and building transportation infrastructure. If you look at a city like Delhi, there are 1,335 vehicles that are being registered in the city on a daily basis. As of July 2017, there were about 1 crore registered vehicles in New Delhi alone, out of which 92 lakh vehicles were private vehicles, 60 lakh vehicles were motorcycles over there. Now, if you look at the sort of road density in Delhi and compare it to a city like Mumbai, again, in Delhi, there are 93 cars per kilometer today. In Mumbai, it's even more pronounced, the problem, because there are the road density is about 453 cars per kilometer. And when you compare that with the sort of demand, the population demand that is being fed into the city on a daily basis, we cannot really afford to follow a model like the United States where there are 800 cars per 1,000 people. India, the car population is 20 cars per 1,000 people. In China, that car population is 90 cars per 1,000 people. Even if we move to 90 cars per 1,000 people, we are looking at making our cities a living hell. So going forward, I believe that there is a very, very serious need to assess how we can promote shared mobility, how we can promote connected mobility, how we can look at feeder networks within our mobility systems which solve for the first and last mile connectivity issues, and how can we look at cleaner fuels, how do we deploy that at a larger scale in our cities to reduce pollution and congestion levels. The government of India has set a very, very ambitious vision over here of promoting shared, connected, and electric mobility. They want the entire vehicle population to move to electric vehicles by 2030. It's something which is of interest to a ride-sharing application like us as well. But I think the whole ecosystem over here needs to come together and start thinking about ways how we can use existing assets better and disincentivize private car ownership.
Thank you, Rashid. That's really enlightening, and the detail, that's the really important thing. It kind of invokes an anecdote in my head said by a professor of Moscow State University in the early 90s. And he said that the government has turned into a model of car ownership, private ownership in general, coming out of Soviet system. He said, what I want to ask is that before we drop a dynamite in a metro system in Moscow, which is great, we need to create a culture of ownership, not simply possibility of ownership. The idea of how people drive, what are the norms, where do you park, then what are the fuels, what is the pollution. None of this is thought through, and I think these are some similar ideas when in India we try to invoke a new way of doing things. When you think to the details that you very clearly outlined. So that I think is really a starting point for a debate. And of course, eventually then we talk about how, in the end, how we're going to finance any of this stuff at private and further levels. So further insight, hopefully from Vikram, who comes from the venture capital and entrepreneurial side of things. And I think that is the culture I think our friend from Moscow was trying to allude to, that was perhaps missing at that moment. Please.
Thank you. Thanks for a great introduction to the problem set. And, I am not betting on the government to really do anything fantastic in the near term, right? This is going to be driven by the consumer from my perspective. As a venture capitalist, we try and look at what we were discussing even before, the inevitabilities in a certain sector, right? So inevitability is that everybody wants to have access to urban transportation. And one thing we do know about Indian consumers is they like cheap and free stuff. So I think till even last year, there was so much talk about the mobile internet, but the so-called Bharat never onboarded till it was made free, right? With the Reliance Jio coming in. And now, of course, data prices dropped by 95%. So we keep talking about electric vehicles, they will come, what will happen. The government has a policy to introduce electric vehicles by 2030. My point is, what if the government made the electric charging infrastructure for free? Right? That's, I think, something that will excite people at the end of the day. And that's something the government can subsidize very easily. So I feel that the biggest blocks right now, particularly as we talk about clean energy and the advent of electric vehicles, is that only electric utilities can sell electricity. So if a gas station has to be adapted into a charging station, they legally cannot do that. So that is a very pressing point of policy issue that the government can act on. And I think, once that starts to happen, if they add a subsidy, you begin to see something happening. Now, as far as traffic congestion, etc., is concerned, I don't think we are going to solve that anytime soon. And I think Indians seem to be highly, I would say, accepting of their circumstances to that extent. I mean, our traffic keeps getting worse, and we don't vote out the governments which are in power, right? So we just deal with it and we move on. So I'm not expecting much movement there, but certainly I'm thinking an incentive towards cleaner energy is something that will happen in the near term.
Thank you very much. That does invoke exactly the kind of thing that we're looking at, the behavior of both the government and that of the consumer, and how they come in to collision or they find solutions. But perhaps technology and technology policy can sometimes be that disruptor. And I think I'm alluding to the notion of smart cities and perhaps connected issues. And no better person than Jerry to speak about. He had enough introductions, so I won't do that anymore. Please.
Thank you, Monty. I think the policy issue is an interesting one. I think the financing one's also an interesting one, so let's take one at a time. I've been thinking about challenging, I've actually approached some universities to take on the role of making life in a city better, reducing the amount of congestion, eliminating lines, making bureaucratic processes faster, and to do it in a scientific way to say what are the underlying causes, not just the superficial causes of these problems. So if cities would first ask the question, what do we owe our citizens in terms of certain, let's call them fundamentals, like I can get to work in less than half an hour. There seems to be a general view that that's about what people think is the right amount of time, and yet we obviously spend a lot more time than that. So now, if the city thought that way, they might ask the question, well, we can't possibly do that with buses and subways, it's too expensive, but they could invite in, and they have, to some extent, Uber and others to say, figure out how to make this happen. And the bicycles play a role in this, and you begin to build a policy framework which gives people this, I'm going to call it, fairly fundamental right, I can get to work in half an hour. Transportation leads pretty quickly to a housing issue. Housing prices have gotten too high in many cities. A good bit of that could be solved if transportation was effective, because you'd live what appears to be an hour away, but the transportation's so fast, I can get to work in half an hour. So there's an interlocking between housing prices and transportation infrastructure that leads first to just apparent reduced costs in housing. Second is, I think we've done a study in New York that says congestion in New York on the streets is costing us about $9 billion a year in lost productivity. So this is enormous, a fairly significant number, which would be worth reducing and maybe putting some other incentives related to cost, like congestion pricing in place, to transfer that cost to those who cause the congestion instead of those who are trying to get to work on time. So I think policy does come into play, but I do think it's important. It's not going to be a kind of top-down restriction on behavior policy. These have tended to fail. It's more likely going to be a promoting innovation and solutions that open up the economy and let inventive people create new solutions.
Thank you. That's exactly very pertinent in terms of how not we come up with solutions, but how we functionalize them, make them real.
And I think we're seeing, I talked to young people in China, and some are telling me now, I'm going to leave Beijing and move to a city that's got clean air, possibly California. These are children of party powers saying, I will not raise my kids in this air. When that begins to be the mantra of young people, I assure you, city leaders will begin to look for solutions.
Thank you for that.